Right. And so our next speaker is Jack Goring, who joins us today from Port Hope, Ontario. And I'm going to move out of the way so that he can get ready. And Jack moved to Canada in 1941 from England, and one of the first things that he did was go canoeing. He paddled from Georgian Bay to Algonquin Park and back again. And he has paddled quite a wide range of northern rivers, including the Rat, the Coppermine, the Churchill, among others, with Eric Morse. And he's going to be speaking to us today about retracing Franklin's route from Yellowknife to Coppermine. And he also has a wide variety of professional experience involving, he graduated as a mechanical engineer. He taught at Trinity College School, teaching a number of topics, and he was also a corrosion engineer for Shell Oil. Many members of his family are here with him today, and let's give him are you good to go if I say? All right, so let's give him a warm welcome, Jack Goring.
I guess you can hear me. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, you've already heard about Eric Morse. So he made this talk. Let's get my pointer out here. It's up there. So I've used the same description. Retracing Franklin's first Arctic expedition, he made this possible because of his extensive planning. In 1966, Eric planned and led a trip down the Coppermine River for a party of 8. In 1970, he planned with the Northwest Territories Centennial Committee a trip for 6 from Point Lake down the Coppermine and a trip for 6 from Point Lake south to Yellowknife. This booklet, put together by Eric Morse in 1970 for the Northwest Territories Centennial, gives a brief retracing of Franklin's expedition of 1820 to 21, with excerpts from Franklin's narrative. How do I make the next slide go? Aha, here he is. Franklin. He was 34 in 1820. So that gives us an idea of some of the ages that we do travel in. In the booklet, Eric states, in the mind of the public, Sir John Franklin seems to be known for his Northwest Passage expedition of 1845, which ended in tragedy. In actual fact, Franklin had already made 2 important expeditions on land and along the Arctic coastline in 1820 to 22 and 1825 to 27. Eric also explains why he thinks the Coppermine should be called Franklin's River, since Franklin was the first white man to canoe down the Coppermine. The 1966 and 70 trips covered Franklin's exploration of 1820-21 from Fort Providence here to Winter Lake, where he spent the winter at Fort Enterprise. It's hard to see that. Before paddling down the Coppermine from Point Lake to the ocean in June and July of 1821, accompanied by Surgeon John Richardson and officers Midshipman George Back and Robert Hood. I was fortunate to be on the 1966 trip down the Coppermine and on the Yellowknife River in 1970. It was renamed the Walking Party because of our 66 portages. Okay. Oh, God, I've got to look at this now. The de Havilland Otter here has 2 canoes strapped to the pontoons, and we're on our way to Lac de Gras. I've gone too far, have we? No. Okay. This is the trip. This is the group. 2 people in there we'll talk about later. But in this particular case, we've got Pierre Trudeau Angus Scott, Bill Mathers, Tom Mathers, Jack Goring, guess who? Eric, and Archie Jones, and Pamela Morse. On to the next one, please. Okay, here we are in Lac de Gras, and this is Pierre Trudeau, Angus Scott, his tent and canoe mate, fighting a little swarm of mosquitoes and black flies. Next. They were very keen to run rapids. The first day, here they are. They've already run into a rock here. Angus Scott, Pierre. So from now on, next. They could go down backwards for a little bit and then land up on another rock. Pierre here, Angus here. They do get through the water all right without any tragedy. Next. In this particular case, we have a real dump. This is a 17-foot Grumman underwater with Tom and Bill Mathers in it. This is the rapids between De Stephanie Lake and Providence Lake. They survived. Come on. Oh, at the end of Providence Lake, it was very windy. As you've seen in some of the past pictures, you have to buckle down. Here, I'm standing on an esker, and we're camping down below it. The canoe here is up to protect the campfire. Pamela Morse, Eric Morse, Archie Jones, Bill Mathers, Angus Scott, Pierre Trudeau, and Tom Mathers. Portaging around Obstruction Rapids, still very windy. We have here Pierre with 3 packs on his back, and Angus trying to hold the canoe in the strong wind. Very bad footing. At the bottom of the east end of Point Lake, which is about a 50 to 60 mile lake, so wind is a real problem in the situation. Here we're protected by this granite ridge, and we had to spend 2 nights here waiting for the wind to drop. This, interestingly, if you look at the date here, June the 15th, 1821, painted by George Back. This is Point Lake. Take a look at the canoes being walked across with dogs and everything like that, just a month before we were in the other water. It was clear. Next. This. Luckily, the next day, this is what we had. And it went on a little bit like that. We were able to go to the next part, which here we have a herd of 56 caribou crossing the lake. Red Rock Lake. These are 2 American fishermen who have just caught a 31-pound lake trout. We asked them, well, are you going to keep it? No. We're throwing everything back that weighs less than 56 pounds. Angus Scott, who came by a few minutes later, said, as they already had an 18-pound lake trout on their line again, he said, well, we'd like to have that if possible. And he said, okay, fine. Angus said, but would you please kill it? We don't want it thrashing around in the bottom of the canoe. So the chap with the pink hat reached into his tackle box, pulled out a .38 revolver, and shot it. It made a very good meal. Here on Rock Nest Lake, very nice campsite in the evening. Strong wind. We're protected from the wind by the trees and the bank behind us. Room for the tents and the fireplace. The real rock nest, and there's Pamela and Eric paddling across Rock Nest Lake. Oh, back to canoeing. Here is Pierre, Angus. They decided they liked the look of this rapids, so they took some of the gear out of their canoe and paddled down. Had quite an exciting time, but were very successful, just shipping a small amount of water. Further down, we came across a family of white wolves, 2 parents here, and 4 cubs along the shore. We also came across these two Americans from New York City, Irvin Streisinger and Alice Wendt, with an open kayak and a lot of gear on the back of their paddle. They were traveling mostly in the evenings to avoid strong winds during the day. A campsite with our little Siksik, keeping an eye on us, of course. Yes. Rocky Defile, one of the difficult rapids, except for the two people who would like to run it. 3 canoes walked portaged across here, and guess what? Here's Pierre and Angus. Partway down, they had shipped a bit of water, but they came into the bottom here, emptied it out, and carried on quite successfully. George Douglas, in his book Lands Forlorn, mentions this rock slide near the Coppermine Mountains in the background, that in August there was a lot of ice there. So I'd been telling Eric that if we got there on August the 1st, and this was August the 1st, and if we found some, what George Douglas had said would be there, ice, we could have ice in our rum. Guess what? It was successful. Next, down below, Tom Mathers had caught a nice Arctic char. This campsite is just a little bit down from the Sandstone Rapids, and here we'd met the Streisingers again. They were paddling, as I said before, in the evenings, and we're going down this rapid here. That picture was up there. They'd said that they were going to go down between these waves here and carry on down. This is the other view from it. This is the view from the campsite down here. What happened was that they got out, but they did not miss the waves. They got swamped. And so they were drifting down these waves here, yelling, "Help." Well, that's kind of difficult to know what to do. But anyway, Pierre and I grabbed a canoe, emptied it, put some warm clothing in, and were able to go down through here. And we found them just around the corner here, pulled up on the beach with the kayak completely full of water, and the two of them very upset by the hypothermia. They were both in not very good shape. Some of the other of our crew went along the top here and dropped firewood down so that we could light a fire to get them warm. Now we're on to Escape Rapids, which Franklin said when he was going by there. He said, "We narrowly escaped foundering." What had happened was that they'd taken in 2 large waves, and if they'd taken in a third, they would have been completely swamped. But they were successful to get through. Okay? And finally, Bloody Falls, where Samuel Hearn in 1771, we'll go back a bit there. No, we've gone too far. Anyway, Samuel Hearn, as you know, I'm sure, he with his Indians, he watched them massacre the Eskimos at that point. This, interestingly enough, in the 1970 group that went down it, 2 people, this was the only rapid they didn't run. Okay? Coppermine. And they have an interesting signpost there, which tells you the distances to Winnipeg, Montreal, and so on. Very windy at that point. And here is the same picture that you saw at the beginning, but now I can tell you about these two. This is Irvin Streisinger and Alice Wendt. So going across them again, Pierre Trudeau, Angus Scott, Bill Mathers, Alice Wendt, Tom Mathers, Jack Goring, Eric and Archie Jones, and Pamela Morse. That's the end of that trip. So now back to the map here, just to review. Here's Yellowknife. Winter Lake is up here with Fort Enterprise. Point Lake, where the two trips started, one going north and one going south, and copper mine on the Gulf. Okay. This is the group. The two groups in Hay River before we got to Yellowknife. And from left to right, John Davis, Hoop Burkett, Jack Matthews, Art Adamson, Scott Griffin, Angus Scott, Peter Blakey, Bill Mathers, John Bailey, Jack Goring, Jim Bailey, and Turk Bailey. 1970, Twin Otter. And of course, it's much more streamlined. It has a heavier load, and you can put the canoes inside instead of strapping them to the pontoons. Scott Griffin, while we were waiting for the ceremonies for the Northwest Territories, we were at Obstruction Rapids fishing. He'd caught this very nice lake trout, and he was having a hard time balancing before he was able to put it back. This is our group, two groups, both with our flags. And you will notice it on the wall here, the yellow flag, which is exactly the same as make or model as they are, the Northwest Heritage Centennial. You can look at it afterwards. But each team had one. Turk Bailey going down the copper mine had a red one. Angus Scott going down the Yellowknife had the blue one. Partway down the lake, we separated, the blue flag going south to the Yellowknife River and the red flag going north to Copper Mine. Our first campsite after leaving Point Lake, completely in the barrens and subject to wind if it's there. Fortunately, we were okay there. Now, this pond shows you what we were up to. A pond, walk, pond, walk, pond, walk, pond, walk. So this was the beginning. We didn't realize how many there were going to be. And this is the end of one of the first portages. Here, the canoes here, ready to put into a little pond here and carry on. This shows you an aerial photograph of the situation here. Our route was here through these ponds from one big lake to this one, which is called Big Lake. And the next day when we paddled it, it was absolutely flat, calm, and that was sort of lucky to take a picture with reflections like that. Here is the problem. There's the river. Why walk? Guess what? It's full of rocks. And it's not very easy to pull, as you saw in one of the last pictures, pulling canoes over rocks. So this was the easiest thing to do. We had to do this umpteen times. Here's a portage halfway across, a 1.5 mile portage at an esker camp, waiting till the next morning to go to the next river. This gives you an idea of the way things were. The river down here, Winter River, Winter Lake, Fort Enterprise, and then down here to Aurora Lake, further down to the Yellowknife River. At Fort Enterprise, we were lucky to run into a group from the University of Alberta. They were an archaeological group who were excavating Fort Enterprise at the time, trying to find out a lot more about it. Tim Losey wrote this report after it. He was one of the people that was at that last campsite there. And here, this is a drawing by George Back showing the three main buildings of Fort Enterprise. Leaving Winter Lake, we had a lovely day, trees, no wind, and guess what? No rocks. Yes. This is Singing Lake, and here we had a cache of food which had been dropped off on the way back up by the planes going to Point Lake, so that we didn't have to double pack our belongings, our food. This was a big help. In some of the lakes, instead of there being a rapids between one and the next one, we found here that there was a marshy area, and you'll notice here we were both having to pole our way through. In a big lake, we would often try to sail either singly or, in this case, we tied the canoes together and with our own sails made good progress down the lake. This campsite had been used quite a lot before. Behind an esker here, bits of old canoes and so on, but we had a very comfortable evening that night. This is an example of some of the rapids between one lake and another. In this one, the two canoes here have lined down. You can see John Davis standing here. I was on the stern line for this canoe, and unfortunately, I slipped a few minutes later. I landed on my chest and cracked a rib. Not a useful thing to have on a trip like that. Porphyry Lake. This was a very nice campsite. Didn't find too many like that, with nice moss, flat ground, easy place to put the tents and to set the canoe up to protect from the wind for the fire and so on. This is Upper Carp Lake. We were paddling into a very strong headwind. We came across this little island, so we decided we'd have to wait until later on in the day for the wind to drop. So what people did was go to sleep, do various jobs, or read a book, or lie down, or whatever. 10 o'clock, we'd had a meal, the wind had dropped, and we were paddling because we were getting behind. We were more concerned that we would not get to Yellowknife in time. You can see the forest fire in the background. At the end of this day, we camped at 2 a.m. Another of these long rapids, and see a canoe has got down here. That was quite a strenuous one to avoid having the canoe pulled out into the stream. Oh, Portage 65, we've just finished it. And here we are ready to paddle the rest of the way to this power station, which is supplying power to a couple of mines further north. Jack Garrett, who is in charge here, he said, well, you've had a pretty rough trip. How would you like a beer? Guess what the answer was? Okay. And here we are, all scrubbed up and clean in Yellowknife. Angus Scott, Pamela Morse, Jack Matthews, Hoop Burkett, Jim Welly, who is the Northwest Territories representative, Eric Morse, Hoop Burkett, Jack Goring, and John Bailey. Yes, next one. In this particular, when one leaves the north, one often has feelings about it. And I thought that this particular saying by Warburton Pike in his book, The Barren Ground of Northern Canada, was appropriate, so I will read it. To the man who is not a lover of nature in all her moods, the barren ground must always be a howling, desolate wilderness. But for my part, I can understand the feeling that prompted Saltatha's answer to the worthy priest, who was explaining to him the beauties of heaven. I quote, "My father, you have spoken well. You have told me that heaven is very beautiful. Tell me now one thing more. Is it more beautiful than the country of the muskox in the summer, when sometimes the mist blows over the lakes, and sometimes the water is blue, and the loons cry very often? That is beautiful. And if heaven is still more beautiful, my heart will be glad, and I shall be content to rest there till I am very old." Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jack, for that presentation. That was a beautiful quote to end with. I think it's true, you do face so many different elements, and that sort of, particularly in that sort of surrounding the wind being a constant challenge.